She had nothing left to give. Yet when she saw the wounded warrior bleeding into the earth, Mercy Whitmore poured her last drops of water between his cracked lips. By sunset, 700 painted faces would surround her cabin, and her single act of kindness would either save her life or end it. The morning sun barely crested the hills when Mercy stepped outside her weathered cabin, carrying the wooden bucket that held everything she owned worth drinking. The well had run dry 3 days ago, and this water, murky and warm, was all that stood between her and the long walk to the creek through territory where people disappeared. Her bare feet moved carefully across the rocky ground as she checked the rabbit snares her father had taught her to set before the fever took him. Empty again. Her stomach twisted with familiar hunger, but she'd learned to ignore that particular pain. At 16, she'd been alone for 8 months now, and survival had become a daily negotiation with hope. That's when she saw him. The man lay face down near the edge of her property line, his dark hair matted with blood, one arm twisted at an unnatural angle. War paint streaked his chest in patterns she didn't recognize, and a bone-handled knife lay just beyond his reach. Everything about him screamed danger, the kind of danger her neighbors whispered about around their fires, the kind that made grown men check their rifles twice before sleeping. But as Mercy crept closer, she saw something that made her chest tighten. His breathing came in short, desperate gasps. Blood seeped from a wound in his side, staining the earth beneath him dark red. His lips were cracked and white, his skin burning with fever. He was dying. The smart thing would be to walk away, to pretend she'd never seen him, to let nature take its course and avoid the complications that helping him would surely bring. Her father had always warned her about the tensions growing between the settlers and the tribes, about how one wrong move could spark violence that would consume everything in its path. But Mercy had never been particularly smart about these things. She knelt beside him, her hand shaking as she tilted his head back slightly. His eyes fluttered open, dark and fierce even in their weakness. For a moment, they stared at each other across a divide that had claimed countless lives. She expected him to recoil, to reach for his knife, to see her as the enemy. Instead, his gaze fixed on the bucket in her hands. Without hesitation, Mercy brought the water to his lips. Drop by precious drop, she let it flow into his mouth, watching his throat work to swallow. She used nearly half of what she had left. Enough water to last her 2 days if she was careful. Enough to keep her alive until she could make the dangerous journey to the creek. When he'd drunk his fill, she tore strips from her already threadbare dress to clean his wounds. The gash in his side was deep but not fatal if treated properly. As she worked, she noticed something that made her blood run cold, a distinctive scar on his shoulder in the shape of a lightning bolt, and around his neck, a necklace bearing symbols that marked him as someone important, someone whose absence would be noticed. The warrior's eyes never left her face as she bandaged his wounds with the last clean cloth she owned. When she finished, he reached up with his good arm and touched her hand briefly. Not a threat, but something that felt almost like gratitude. Then his eyes closed, and his breathing deepened into the rhythm of healing sleep. Mercy sat back on her heels, suddenly aware of what she'd done. She'd just saved the life of a man whose people were at war with hers. She'd used her last water, her last bandages, her last reserves of safety on someone who might wake up and kill her. Someone whose very presence on her land could be seen as an act of war by any settler who found him here. But as she looked at his peaceful face, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The warm glow of having done something purely good in a world that seemed determined to punish goodness at every turn. That feeling lasted exactly as long as it took her to hear the sound that froze her blood. Hoofbeats. Many of them, coming fast across the valley floor. And from the rhythm she could tell they weren't the horses of settlers or cavalry. These were the mounts of warriors, and they were heading straight for her cabin. Mercy's heart hammered against her ribs as the thunder of hooves grew louder. She looked down at the unconscious warrior. Akacheta. She'd heard him whisper the name when she'd given him water. Then at her cabin 20 yards away. She'd never make it in time to hide him, and even if she could, the blood trail would give him away. The smart thing would be to run, to disappear into the woods behind her cabin, and let whatever was coming find what it would find. But something in her refused to abandon the man she'd just saved. If these riders meant him harm, her presence might be the only thing standing between him and death. The first warrior crested the hill like something out of a nightmare. His horse moved with the fluid grace of wind across water, and the man himself seemed carved from stone and fury. War paint covered his face in bold strokes of red and black, and feathers fluttered from his hair as he rode. Behind him came another, then another, until the hillside seemed to flow with mounted figures. 10 warriors, 20, 50. Mercy had never seen so many in one place, had never imagined such a sight was possible. They moved with perfect coordination, spreading out to surround her property like water flowing around a stone. Their horses snorted and stamped, but the riders themselves sat motionless as death, their eyes scanning every inch of her land. The lead warrior, a man whose presence commanded attention even from a distance, raised his hand, and the entire war party stopped as one. His gaze found Mercy immediately, kneeling beside Akecheta with blood on her hands and fear written across her face. For a long moment, nobody moved. Mercy felt the weight of 100 stares, each one calculating her threat level, her intentions, her chances of survival. She could smell the horses, hear the creak of leather and the whisper of wind through feathers. The morning air thrummed with tension so thick it felt solid. Then the lead warrior dismounted. He was older than the others, with gray streaking his long hair and scars marking his arms like a roadmap of battles survived. When he walked, the earth seemed to acknowledge his presence. This was a man accustomed to being obeyed, to having his word treated as law. Behind him, the other warriors remained mounted but ready, their hands resting on weapons that could end her life in a heartbeat. As he approached, Mercy saw something that made her stomach clench with new fear. The lightning bolt scar on his shoulder was identical to Akecheta's, and the way his eyes fixed on the unconscious warrior told her everything she needed to know about their relationship. This wasn't just a war party looking for a missing warrior. This was a father looking for his son. The chief stopped 3 feet away from her, close enough that she could see the pain behind his fierce expression. His gaze moved from Akecheta's bandaged wounds to the empty bucket beside Mercy, to the torn strips of her dress that now served as dressings. When he looked back at her face, she saw a flicker of something unexpected. Confusion. He spoke then, his voice carrying the authority of thunder, words in a language she didn't understand but whose meaning seemed clear enough. A question, a demand for explanation. But before Mercy could even attempt to respond, something shifted in the air around them. More hoofbeats, coming from the opposite direction. The warriors tensed immediately, hands moving to weapons, horses sidling nervously. These new riders weren't painted for war. They wore the blue uniforms of the cavalry, and they were coming fast. The chief's head snapped toward the sound of approaching cavalry, and in that instant, Mercy saw the situation explode into something far beyond her control. The warriors behind him shifted like a flock of birds sensing a predator, weapons appearing in hands with deadly efficiency. What had been a tense but manageable encounter was about to become a massacre with her caught in the middle. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No!" She threw herself across Akecheta's unconscious form, spreading her arms wide as if her small body could somehow shield him from what was coming. The chief's eyes widened at her action, genuine surprise flickering across his weathered features. In all his years of warfare, he'd clearly never seen a settler willing to die protecting one of his people. The cavalry emerged from the tree line like a blue tide of trouble, 12 soldiers led by a lieutenant whose fresh face marked him as someone still believing war could be clean and simple. When he saw the war party surrounding Mercy's cabin, his hand went immediately to his saber. "Stand down," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly on the command. "Release the girl and withdraw from this territory." The chief turned slowly, his movement deliberate and loaded with menace. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented but perfectly clear. "We take what is ours. That girl is under the protection of the United States Army," the lieutenant replied, though Mercy noticed his hand trembling on his weapon. "Any harm to her will be considered an act of war." A cold smile touched the chief's lips. "War?" He gestured to his warriors, who seemed to multiply in the morning light as more emerged from positions Mercy hadn't even known they occupied. "You bring 12 boys to speak of war?" The lieutenant's face went pale as he realized what Mercy was only beginning to understand. This wasn't a random encounter. The war party hadn't just happened to find Akecheta here. They'd been tracking him, following a trail that led directly to her doorstep, and now they were face to face with exactly the kind of confrontation that sparked the conflicts her father had warned her about. "There's been a misunderstanding," Mercy called out, her voice stronger than she felt. Both groups of men turned to look at her, and she realized she might be the only person present who didn't want to start shooting. "I helped him. He was hurt, and I gave him water." "You what?" The lieutenant's voice climbed higher. "You aided a hostile warrior?" "He was dying," she said simply. The chief studied her face intently, as if trying to read something written there in a language he was only beginning to understand. He spoke again in his own tongue, a quick series of words that made several of his warriors murmur among themselves. Then he looked down at Akecheta, noting the careful way his wounds had been dressed, the clean water bucket, the strips of cloth that had clearly come from the girl's own clothing. But before anyone could respond to this revelation, Akecheta's eyes fluttered open. The young warrior's gaze moved from his father's face to the soldiers behind him, to Mercy still kneeling protectively beside him. When he tried to sit up, pain made him gasp, but he forced himself upright anyway. He spoke to his father in urgent, hushed tones, gesturing toward Mercy with his good arm. The chief's expression shifted as he listened to his son's words. The hard lines around his eyes softened slightly, and when he looked at Mercy again, there was something different in his gaze, something that might have been respect. "My son says you gave him life," the chief said slowly. "Says you used your last water when you had nothing. Anyone would have done the same," Mercy replied, though they all knew that wasn't true. The lieutenant, growing increasingly agitated by this conversation he couldn't control, took a step forward. "I don't care what she did. She's a settler under military protection, and I'm ordering you to—" The chief's hand moved to his tomahawk so quickly it seemed like magic. "You order nothing here." "Boy!" The morning air crackled with the electricity of violence about to break loose. Weapons were being drawn on both sides, horses snorting and shifting, men's faces settling into the grim masks they wore before killing began. And in the center of it all, Mercy realized that her single act of kindness had created a knot that might only be untied with blood. The tension stretched like a bowstring about to snap. Mercy could see fingers tightening on triggers, hands shifting to weapon grips, horses sensing their riders' readiness for violence. In seconds, her small patch of land would become a battlefield, and everyone present seemed willing to die for principles she didn't fully understand. Except Akecheta. The wounded warrior struggled to his feet, swaying slightly but refusing his father's steadying hand. When he spoke, his voice carried across the clearing with surprising strength, each word carefully chosen in English so everyone could understand. "She is under my protection now." The statement hit like lightning. The lieutenant's jaw dropped. Several warriors shifted uncomfortably. Even the chief seemed taken aback by his son's declaration. In the culture of the Lakota, such a pronouncement carried the weight of law, binding the speaker to defend the protected person with his life. "You can't do that," the lieutenant sputtered. "She's a citizen of— She gave me life when she could have let me die," Akecheta continued, ignoring the soldier completely, his gaze fixed on his father. "The spirits brought me to her door for a reason. She has earned the right to walk safely among our people." The chief's face was unreadable, but Mercy could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes. This was his son, heir to leadership of their band, making a decision that could affect the delicate balance of power in the entire territory. But it was also a decision rooted in honor, in the old ways that demanded debts be repaid. "And what of them?" The chief nodded toward the cavalry. "They will not understand our ways." It was then that Mercy made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She stood slowly, positioning herself between the two groups, and spoke with a clarity that cut through the morning air. "I choose to go with them." Every eye turned to her. The lieutenant looked horrified. Several warriors murmured among themselves, but Akecheta smiled slightly, as if he'd been expecting exactly this response. "Miss, you can't seriously be considering—" the lieutenant began. "I am," Mercy said firmly. "I helped Akecheta because it was right. If that means I need to answer for it to his people, then that's what I'll do." She looked directly at the chief. "But I won't be the reason men die today. If my going with you prevents bloodshed, then that's where I belong." The chief studied her for a long moment, his weathered features revealing nothing. Around them, the warriors waited for his decision, while the cavalry fidgeted nervously in their saddles. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows that seemed to divide the world into clear lines of light and dark. Finally, the chief spoke. "You would trust your life to people you have been taught to fear." "I would trust my life to people who understand honor," Mercy replied. "Your son could have killed me when I helped him. Instead, he offered protection. That tells me everything I need to know about your people." The lieutenant made one last desperate attempt. "I cannot allow a civilian to leave with a hostile war party." "My orders—" "Your orders," the chief interrupted, his voice carrying the finality of winter, "mean nothing here." He turned to Mercy, and for the first time, something that might have been respect flickered in his eyes. If you come willingly, you will be treated with honor. But know this, once you cross into our territory, there may be no returning to this world. Mercy felt the weight of the choice settling on her shoulders. Behind her lay everything familiar, her cabin, her land, the life she'd built from the ashes of her family's dreams. Ahead lay the unknown, a people whose ways she didn't understand, and the very real possibility that she might never see another sunrise. But as she looked at Akecheta, still swaying on his feet but standing proud despite his wounds, she realized something that surprised her. For the first time in months, she wasn't alone. The chief raised his hand, and one of his warriors brought forward a painted horse, its coat gleaming in the morning sun. The animal was beautiful, clearly bred for speed and endurance, with intelligent eyes that seemed to appraise Mercy as carefully as its rider did. "You will ride with honor," the chief said, helping her mount. His hands were surprisingly gentle, and she caught a glimpse of something paternal in his expression. "My name is Tatanka Iyotake. You saved my son's life. That debt will not be forgotten." As Mercy settled onto the horse's back, she heard the lieutenant calling out behind them. "This is a mistake. When word reaches Fort Collins, there will be consequences. The army will come looking for her." Tatanka Iyotake turned in his saddle, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Let them come. They will find only what the wind tells them." The war party began to move, flowing like water around Mercy's position. She found herself surrounded but not trapped, protected rather than captured. Akecheta rode beside her despite his wounds, his presence steady and reassuring in a world that had suddenly become completely foreign. As they crested the first hill, Mercy looked back to see her cabin growing smaller in the distance. The lieutenant and his men remained where she'd left them, their blue uniforms stark against the brown earth. She wondered if she'd ever see that little house again, ever sleep in the bed her father had built with his own hands. But then Akecheta spoke softly beside her. "You showed great courage back there. Not many would have chosen as you did." "I didn't really have a choice," she replied. "Not if I wanted to live with myself afterward." He nodded, understanding flickering in his dark eyes. "My father will want to know more about you. Why you helped me. Why you chose to come with us rather than hide behind the soldiers' protection." Mercy considered this as they rode deeper into territory she'd never seen before. The landscape was beautiful in a harsh way, all rolling hills and scattered trees, with mountains rising in the distance like the backbone of the world. She'd always thought of this as empty land, dangerous and wild. But seeing it through the eyes of the warriors around her, she began to understand that it was anything but empty. It was home. "What should I tell him?" she asked. "The truth," Akecheta said simply. "My people value honesty above all else. If you speak from your heart, he will hear it." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the horses moving with the easy rhythm of animals bred for long journeys. Around them, the warriors maintained their alert watchfulness, but there was something different about their demeanor now. They no longer looked at her as a potential threat, but rather as someone under their protection. If you were Mercy, would you trust these strangers with your life, risking everything for honor? Or would you have tried to escape back to the familiar world of settlers and soldiers? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Mercy discovered at their destination would challenge everything she thought she knew about courage, loyalty, and what it truly means to belong somewhere. It was midday when they reached the edge of the tribal lands, and Mercy's breath caught in her throat. Spread across the valley below was a sight that no settler had ever lived to describe, a massive encampment that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Hundreds of lodges dotted the landscape like giant flowers, smoke rising from countless fires. The sound that reached her ears was unlike anything she'd ever heard. The voices of children playing, women singing, dogs barking, horses nickering. It was the sound of a living, breathing community. 700 warriors, Tatanka Iyotake said, noting her expression. And their families. Nearly 3,000 people who call this place home. Mercy felt her mouth go dry. She'd heard estimates of tribal numbers from traders and soldiers, but seeing the reality was something else entirely. This wasn't the small, scattered group she'd imagined. This was a nation. "And they all know about me?" she asked. Akecheta's smile was enigmatic. "News travels fast here. By now, everyone knows that a settler girl gave her last water to save a warrior's life. They're curious to meet someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to make such a choice." As they began their descent into the valley, Mercy realized that her real test was just beginning. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. The morning's confrontation with the cavalry seemed simple compared to what lay ahead, earning the trust and respect of 3,000 people who had every reason to see her as their enemy. The procession into the camp was unlike anything Mercy could have imagined. As word spread of their arrival, people emerged from their lodges like flowers opening to the sun. Children ran alongside the horses, their laughter bright and curious. Women paused in their work to watch, some with suspicion, others with frank interest. Warriors nodded respectfully to Tatanka Iyotake, but their eyes were all on the pale girl riding beside his wounded son. Mercy felt the weight of hundreds of stares, each one carrying questions she couldn't answer. Her worn dress, patched and faded, seemed shabby compared to the beautifully decorated clothing around her. The intricate beadwork, the rich colors of painted hides, the elegant braiding of hair adorned with feathers and shells. It was a level of artistry that made her feel like a sparrow among eagles. But what struck her most was something she hadn't expected. The children. They looked just like children everywhere. Curious, playful, full of life. Some hung back shyly behind their mother's skirts, while others boldly reached out to touch her horse as they passed. Their laughter was universal, needing no translation. Tatanka Iyotake led them to the center of the camp, where the largest lodge stood decorated with symbols that seemed to tell stories in a language of paint and hide. As they dismounted, an elderly woman emerged from this central dwelling. Her hair was silver white, braided with ornaments that caught the light, and her face held the kind of wisdom that came from seeing many seasons pass. When she looked at Mercy, the girl felt as though she was being measured for something far more important than clothes. "This is Winona," Tatanka Iyotake said. "She is the keeper of our stories, the one who remembers what must not be forgotten. She will decide if your actions have earned you a place among us." Winona approached slowly, her gaze never leaving Mercy's face. When she spoke, her English was precise and careful, as if each word had been chosen for its exact weight. "You gave water to my grandson when you had little for yourself." "Yes," Mercy replied simply. "You knew he was Lakota. You knew the danger." "Yes, yet you chose to help him anyway." Mercy nodded, unsure what else to say. The old woman continued to study her, and the entire camp seemed to hold its breath waiting for her judgment. Finally, Winona smiled, an expression that transformed her weathered features into something beautiful. "Then you understand something that many do not. That kindness recognizes no boundaries, that mercy knows no tribe." She stepped forward and placed her hands on Mercy's shoulders. "You will stay in my lodge tonight. Tomorrow when the sun rises you will choose. Return to your people with our blessing and our protection, or remain here and learn our ways. But know this, whatever you choose, you will always be welcome at our fires." The crowd around them began to disperse, people returning to their daily tasks, but with a new energy, a buzz of conversation about the unprecedented events of the day. Mercy felt a mixture of relief and overwhelming uncertainty. She'd been accepted, at least temporarily, but the weight of the choice ahead pressed down on her like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. As Winona led her toward the lodge, Mercy caught sight of Akacheta being helped away by two other warriors. Before he disappeared from view, he turned back and caught her eye. His nod was slight but unmistakable, a promise that whatever happened next, she wouldn't face it alone. But as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Mercy couldn't shake the feeling that something was building on the horizon, something that would test not just her courage, but the fragile peace that her act of kindness had created. The lodge was larger inside than it appeared from the outside, with buffalo hides stretched over wooden poles, creating a space that felt both intimate and grand. Painted symbols covered the walls, animals, celestial bodies, and geometric patterns that seemed to dance in the flickering light of the central fire. Winona moved with practiced efficiency, preparing food and bedding while sharing stories that helped Mercy understand the world she'd entered. "My people have lived on this land for generations beyond counting," the old woman said as she worked. "We know every stream, every hunting ground, every sacred place. But lately, more settlers come each season, and with them, soldiers who see only empty land to be claimed." Mercy listened, beginning to understand the deeper currents that had brought her to this moment. Her own family had been part of that westward push, seeking opportunity in a place that others already called home. The realization brought with it a complicated mix of guilt and understanding. "Your son, Akacheta, he was scouting near settler territory when he was wounded," she asked. Winona's hands paused in their work. "He was returning from a peace mission, Some of our young warriors grow restless, speak of driving out all settlers before more arrive. Akecheta went to speak with the chiefs of neighboring bands, to urge patience, to seek a path that doesn't lead to war. The weight of this revelation settled over Mercy like a blanket. She'd saved the life of a peacemaker, someone working to prevent the very conflicts that terrified settlers like herself. But she'd also learned something else. War was closer than she'd realized, balanced on a knife's edge that could tip either way. As evening deepened, the sounds of the camp began to change. The laughter of children gave way to the low murmur of adult conversation, the crackle of fires, and something else, a rhythmic drumbeat that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the earth itself. "They're telling the story of what happened today," Winona explained, seeing Mercy's curious expression. "Your story. How a settler girl chose compassion over fear. How she rode willingly into danger rather than see blood spilled. Such stories become part of our history, passed down through generations." Mercy felt overwhelmed by the thought. "I just did what anyone should do. But few would," Winona replied gently. "That's what makes it worth remembering." As they prepared for sleep, a commotion outside caught their attention. Voices were raised in urgent discussion, and through the lodge's entrance, Mercy could see warriors gathering around fires, their faces grim in the dancing light. "What's happening?" she asked. Before Winona could answer, Tatanka Iotake's voice called from outside. "Winona, bring the girl. She needs to hear this." They emerged to find the chief standing with several other warriors, all of them wearing expressions that made Mercy's stomach clench with dread. When Tatanka Iotake spoke, his words carried the weight of impending storm. "Riders came from the east. The lieutenant who wanted to take you back, he has returned to Fort Collins and told his commander that we captured a settler woman. They're calling it an act of war." Mercy felt the blood drain from her face. "But I came willingly. I chose to come here." "They don't care about choice," another warrior said bitterly. "They see only what serves their purpose, a reason to bring soldiers into our lands." Tatanka Iotake continued, his voice heavy with the burden of leadership. "They're gathering forces, not just from Fort Collins, but from 3 other military posts. By tomorrow's end, we could face 500 soldiers demanding your return." The implications crashed over Mercy like a cold wave. Her act of kindness, meant to prevent bloodshed, had instead provided the excuse for exactly the kind of large-scale conflict everyone had been trying to avoid. The young lieutenant's wounded pride had escalated a simple misunderstanding into a potential massacre. "I have to go back," she said immediately. "I have to tell them the truth. It may be too late for truth," Winona said sadly. "When men want war, they find ways to justify it." Akecheta appeared at the edge of the firelight, his wounds freshly dressed but his steps still uncertain. "There's something else," he said grimly. "Our scouts report that some of our own young warriors are using this as a call to arms. They say the time for peace has passed, that we should strike first before the soldiers can organize." Mercy realized with growing horror that she stood at the center of forces spiraling beyond anyone's control. Her single act of compassion had become the catalyst for exactly the kind of devastating conflict that both sides had been dreading. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, armies were gathering that would arrive with the dawn. Dawn broke gray and ominous, with storm clouds gathering on both horizons, literal ones in the sky, and human ones on the plains. Mercy stood with Tatanka Iotake and his council, watching as dust clouds marked the approach of the cavalry from the east, while war parties of young Lakota warriors assembled to the west. Between them lay a valley that would soon become a battlefield, unless someone found a way to pull back from the brink. 500 soldiers, a scout reported breathlessly, led by a colonel who's never lost a battle. They carry cannons. "And our young warriors number 300, with more arriving from allied bands," another voice added. "They paint their faces for war and sing death songs." Mercy felt the weight of impending catastrophe pressing down on her shoulders. Everything she'd tried to prevent was about to happen on a scale that would echo through history. But as she watched the two forces converging, an idea began to form. Desperate, dangerous, but perhaps their only hope. "Let me go to them," she said suddenly. "Alone, before they meet." Tatanka Iotake shook his head immediately. "You would be killed before you spoke 10 words. Soldiers in battle mood see only enemies." "Not if I carry something they can't ignore," Mercy replied, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "A flag of truce, and proof that I was never captured." She turned to face the assembled council, her heart racing but her voice steady. "Give me Akecheta and a small escort. Let us ride to the middle ground between the armies. When both sides see that he's alive and I'm unharmed, when they hear the truth of what really happened, maybe reason can still prevail. And if it doesn't? Winona asked quietly. Then at least we'll have tried something other than violence first. The next hour passed in a blur of preparation. Akecheta, still weak but determined, mounted his horse beside Mercy. 5 warriors rode with them, carrying white cloth that caught the morning wind like prayers made visible. As they crossed the valley floor toward the space between the armies, Mercy could feel hundreds of eyes watching their progress. The cavalry had formed battle lines, their blue uniforms stark against the brown earth. But when they saw the small party approaching under a flag of truce, discipline held. Officers raised spyglasses, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. When they reached the midpoint, Mercy dismounted and walked forward alone. Her voice, when she called out, carried clearly across the valley. I am Mercy Whitmore. I was never captured. I came here willingly to prevent bloodshed, and I'm here now for the same reason. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a single rider broke from the cavalry lines, the young lieutenant from the day before, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. You were coerced, he shouted, threatened into saying these things. I was shown more kindness by these people than I've known in months, Mercy replied. They fed me, sheltered me, and protected me. The only threat to my safety is the war you're about to start. The colonel in command rode forward, his weathered face skeptical but listening. Behind him, Mercy could see soldiers murmuring among themselves, their certainty beginning to waver. Akecheta joined her then, his presence a living testament to her words. I was dying when she found me, he called out in clear English. She gave me her last water, her last food, her last bandages. She saved my life when she could have let me die. The colonel studied them both for a long moment. Then, incredibly, he began to smile. Well, I'll be damned, he said finally. A peace treaty negotiated by a girl who doesn't know when to mind her own business. 3 months later, Mercy stood in the doorway of a new cabin, built where 3 territories met, a place where settlers, soldiers, and Lakota could trade safely under the protection of the unprecedented agreement that had grown from that morning in the valley. Akecheta, fully healed, worked beside her father-in-law Tatanka Iyotake to establish the trading post that would serve as neutral ground for all peoples. The young lieutenant had been reassigned to a desk job back east, a fate he considered worse than death. The colonel had been promoted for his role in preventing a war, and Mercy had found something she'd never expected, a family that crossed all the boundaries people said couldn't be crossed. But most importantly, she'd learned that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change the course of history if you're brave enough to see them through to the end. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with courage so unexpected and an ending so powerful, it will stay with you long after the final word. Click on the video now.